How are you playing that?
Good morning, how are you?
Good morning. It's fun to sit on this side of the table. I get accused of being over here more often than you think. Did you get that one?
Oh, we usually, I was a little thrown off. I don't, Tim usually sits right there, but.
That's where I was
Yeah,
told
busy.
I had to sit when I came.
That is not true.
Give me a heads up in case I'm not sitting in the right seat.
No, I don't think there is such a thing. Other than that one, that should be there.
Okay.
There we go.
So we have a quorum, I think, right?
Yes, you do.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and proceed? Are you ready, you're taping?
Yes.
Okay. So, we're here today to receive the comprehensive annual financial report from the outside auditors, and we do have a quorum, so please proceed. Why don't you just identify yourselves for the record, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Bob Offerman, a CPA and a partner in the firm. It's kind of hard to pronounce, but Hochschild Bloom & Company. We've been your outside auditor. Now, this was the second year that we completed the audit for St. Louis County. And this is one of our audit managers, Victoria Daly. So Victoria, really, she runs the audit. She's out here with the staff. Every day they're here for a month and a half. So she oversees the staff and supervises the staff working on the audit. And her and I confer. And we have, first of all, the county has a really good staff, and we actually have weekly meetings during the audit process. Thanks to Vicki. She sets that up. And Mark participates in that. So we have like a weekly planning meeting, so Vicki brings an agenda. We might bring items that we want to address in the audit. So as the audit goes along, those meetings help, to be sure everything's on track and that we're addressing everything that we need to, because there's a lot of hours and time that goes into producing this report. A lot of people within the county and outside the county are involved in order to gather all the information that needs to be put in your annual financial statements. So your financial statement, it's called the CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. And where does that come from? That comes from the GFOA. The GFOA, your financial statements are, once they're produced and put together, Vicki and her staff sends them off to the GFOA. And the GFOA has peer reviewers, and there'll be usually 2 outside reviewers and a staff reviewer. All will review your financial statements to be sure that what the county's reporting is in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. So, and then it takes probably 6 months, and they'll report back to the county if there's anything that they don't like, and what the presentation of the report is. They'll make comments that have to be corrected during the next fiscal year. But the county's always received its certificate. I don't know if you know how many years you've got, but probably.
I think it's probably in excess of 30 years.
30 years.
Yes.
But just the process is good for the general public, that they know, the county's. This is actually, these are the county's financial statements, and the county's responsible for preparing the statements. We assist in that process, but the county, they're responsible. But the general public knows when they get this, county gets this award, that the users of the financial statements and bond underwriters. The bond underwriters want to be sure that your financial reporting is according with generally accepted accounting principles, so they have a comfort level that the information they need is included in the CAFR, and the bond underwriters can use that when they're issuing their opinions on your bond issues. So there's a lot of information in this report, and so the first thing in there is the cover page. And I said this is our second year doing the audit, and actually it's the budget director, Paul, who I don't know if he takes the pictures. He uses this same cover on the budget report for the county, and then historically the counties used it on their CAFR. So last year there was a lake and elk on there. This year, I mean, the photo is nice, but from my perspective, I don't think it projects a robust, county with, economic activities going on. This is more, to me, it's subtle, it's a nice picture, it's a.
No offense, I don't care about the picture, let's get
Yeah,
to
to the
the.
food
Yeah.
board,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, yeah, great. So there's the table of contents, the first thing in there. Talks about, there's an introductory section, there's a letter that Vicki wrote, it's called the transmittal letter, copy of last year's certificate. And then the financial section has our independent auditors report, management discussion analysis. They've got all the financial statements. And then behind that, there's required supplemental information, statistical information. So there's a lot of things in the report. But let's go back to the financial section. Right in front of the tab is our independent auditors report, that's what you're paying us for, issuing this opinion on your financial statements. And so the opinion that says your financial statements is called an unmodified opinion. Your financial statements report with U.S. generally accepted accounting standards. And behind that is the management discussion and analysis. And the one thing, if you go to page 8, there's actually several different methods of accounting that are included in your CAFR. But the one is called the government-wide, which is accrual basis of accounting. And on page 8, there's a snapshot of your government-wide financial statements. You see it's broken down into two categories, the governmental activities and the business type activities, and then total primary government. So the only thing this doesn't include is like trust and agency funds. So on the governmental activities, you had almost $2 billion, $1.9 billion of assets. So your assets were up 53,000. They went from $1,936,000 to $1,989,000. There's deferred outflows. Deferred outflows are an accounting treatment of measurements that, and a big part of that is the pension measurements. But deferred outflows is things that will become an expense in the next couple of years. Actually, that $81 million will be amortized over 4 years. Then you have liabilities of $997 million compared to $1,076 million. So your liabilities were down 80,000. So your assets were up 53 million. Your liabilities were down $80 million. The deferred inflows is income that will come into the system, the county over the next few years. That's the $75 million.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Sure.
Am I correct that revenue was down from 17 to 18?
Yeah,
Am I reading that correctly?
Well, the revenue is not really presented on this page.
You don't present revenue as an asset then?
No.
Okay.
No. Your assets and liabilities are based on the changes between your revenues and expenses. So your net change, your net position at the bottom, actually went up $63 million, or 7% increase in your net position for the governmental
Okay.
activities.
Let's see, okay, thank you.
But in a second, we'll see where that $63 million came from.
All right.
The business type activities, that's the Spirit Airport. So the operation of Spirit Airport is accounted for as an enterprise fund, as a business activity. And pretty much the assets and the liabilities were almost the same in 2017 to 18. And then already on page 10, okay, here's where you can see that your changes in your assets and liabilities are based on what your revenues and expenses are. The $63 million that we saw increase in your net position, the first column on the left and all the way down towards the bottom, you'll see a change in net position, $62 million. So you had a surplus in your governmental activities, $62 million. There was a prior period adjustment of $946, $1 million. And that had to do with the Justice Center commission or commissary. In the past, the county always accounted for that as a agency fund, but it was determined that wasn't correct. It was moved over to a special revenue fund that increased your net position by $1 million. So that's $63 million. The revenues over expenditures and the change in one prior period adjustment. that $63 million increased the fund balance from $937 million to almost $1 billion, $999 million. The revenues are at the top, almost $810 million compared to $737 million. So your revenues were up $72 million. Most of that, a lot of that was in the taxes. Taxes, you see, went from 399 to 445. A lot of that had to do with Proposition P. You know, probably half of that increase at least is from Proposition P.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
real quick? And this is probably a question for my colleagues. Page 9, the changes in net position, the first bullet point, the public safety function, which includes police, judicial administration, and justice services. Is that consistent with how we are now defining public safety?
No.
There's more to it than just that.
Okay. Is that something that moving forward should be consistent now with how we're defining public safety?
Well, remember we added in the ordinance, we added family court and municipal court and county counselor's office.
Okay,
So that would increase.
okay. Just something I noticed. I
This was
thought that when we,
traditionally-
and this is looking for 2018, but.
And this was traditionally what it was defined as,
Okay,
for Prop P expenses.
right.
Right.
But now we've expanded that.
Okay, and that was my
Yep.
thought, but I just wanted to clarify that.
I think the county's working on right to better define the property.
We've
Yeah.
done that recently,
Yes, did.
and so I
Okay.
guess moving forward then, your reporting would be consistent with how we're defining it.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, this is actually a write-up or a summary of changes that actually we write for this, so we will make that adjustment
Okay.
for next year.
Right.
Yeah, so back on page 10, so we saw the revenues were up $72 million. The expenses were up $24 million. They were, for governmental activity, $748 million compared to $723 million. Then we said your net position went up $63 million. And the Spirit Airport there in the middle, their net position changed by $1 million. So their revenues were up and their expenditures were up, but the net change was $700,000 surplus.
And Bob, you might get to this, I hope I'm not jumping ahead of you.
Sure.
I want to know if Spirit is making money or losing money or breaking even. Can you answer that in this document somewhere?
Well, no, right there, yeah, basically a break even. You made $200,000 in 17 and you made $700,000 in 18. That's on a economic full accrual basis of accounting. Their assets get depreciated in there. So, you know, they brought in 22 million and spent 21 million, so, you know, it's pretty close to a break even.
Okay, thank you.
Before you move on, your graph on page 11 with respect to revenues, with the exception of sales tax, it'd be fair to say that everything else pretty much remains static between 17 and 18?
Yeah, monetarily, you can see that on page 10. The grant revenues were up $5 million, so that's, you know, that's a big good. You know, property taxes were up, you know, $2 million, so, but the big part, the big part is,
Property tax increase is negligible.
yes,
Agreed? Right.
right.
The only real appreciable increase is in sales tax, and if I understand you correctly, that's attributable to Prop P.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
If I
So
go
for
back,
all intents and purposes, the county's revenue did not increase with the exception of Prop P between 17 and 18.
That's a fair comment, yes.
Okay, thank you.
going back to Spirit just for a second, you talked about being an enterprise zone. Is the county, if we make any revenue there, is any of it allowed to leave the Spirit footprint, the revenue? Since it's an enterprise zone?
I believe, it's not an enterprise zone, it's enterprise fund, which is,
Okay.
the enterprise zone is the new tax legislation where people could develop things in an enterprise zone and get special tax treatment. But enterprise fund, I don't think that, well, we're gonna go back there anyway, let's go to page.
I guess my real question is, does the profit from Spirit Airport go back into general revenue? Is that a yes or a no?
I'd say no.
So where does it go?
Well, it gets invested in, you know.
That's what I would call an
infrastructure.
enterprise,
Right.
so it stays at
Yeah,
Spirit.
right. I mean, I don't know if historically, we could check that, Tim, if historically any money, I don't know, if you know, if any money's ever come out of there.
Do you budget any transfers from the
We're kind of down.
enterprise fund to
I do too.
We're kind of down.
governmental funds?
course, you know, I just wonder always out loud when we have an asset like that, are we better off keeping it or selling it, or, you know, I don't know what the value of it would be if we're allowed to even sell it. But clearly, we're not making a lot of money on it. It's not a money loser, but we're not making money on it,
Right.
just so to speak.
Yeah.
So, okay.
If you're providing a service to.
Right.
And to Tim's point, sources of revenue are critical at this point.
Yeah,
So we have to look at what are our options, you know?
right. I think things like Spirit help attract, you know, corporations to St. Louis.
Sure.
We haven't had a lot of corporations moving to St. Louis, but we have the corporate headquarters moving here now, and, you know, they'll look at those kinds of things, you know, availability of, you know, what's your infrastructure, what kinds of things are available to them. But if you want, Jim, we could research that and get back to you.
Well, I'm just wondering what the value of the airport would be to
Oh,
a
the
private,
value.
you know, on the market.
Mhm.
Okay.
So on page 20, here's your government-wide with all, we looked at the snapshot, here's the government-wide financial statements showing all the detail. Again, you know, about third of the way down, you know, your total assets were almost $2 billion. So when you look at it, you have what's called capital assets. That's property, equipment. You have infrastructure is a big part of that, roads and bridges. So you have $1.1 billion invested in capital assets. That's 56% of your assets. You also have, you know, cash. So how liquid are you? You have $334 million in cash and short-term investments. That's 17% of your assets. Receivables, $134 million. That's 12% of your assets. So those three categories represent 80-some% of your total assets. The capital assets, if you turn back to page 61, there's an accounting for the capital assets. So 61 is the governmental activities. At the very top, it's got capital assets not being depreciated, which is land and construction in progress. So construction projects, they get capitalized, and then when they're completed, that's the 45. You see, there's $58 million spent, 45 million then got brought down to the capital assets being depreciated. That's part of the $63 million of capital assets that the county purchased in 2018. There was $11 million of old assets, and you can see $11 million of old assets written off. If you go down to the depreciation below that, there was $11 million, because those were fully depreciated assets that were being written off. And then the depreciation, all your assets get depreciated, so there's $67 million of depreciation on the assets on the governmental activities. So on the next page, the Spirit, which is called business type activities. So your investment, Tim, in the assets is about $90 million you got invested. You've taken $38 million of depreciation on that. You took $2 million of depreciation during this fiscal year. They had some construction in progress. Their assets added to the capital assets were about $1 million. So that's really not a lot. But, at the bottom, it shows you then the depreciation by department. Like general government, there's $8 million. Public safety, almost $10 million. Highways and traffic, $43 million. So that's the depreciation taken on your capital assets, because the capital assets bring their historical cost, you know, minus depreciation. And then the Spirit, the $2 million of depreciation. And so the business type, so you've got your investment after depreciation is about $52 million in the Spirit Airport. So let's go back into our main statement on page 20 again. So we looked at that's your assets, your liabilities. You have total liabilities of $997 million. Now, the biggest part of that is the bonds, your notes payable. Your notes payable are $557 million. You got to add, if you add the 529 and then the short-term portion of 27 million. So 56% of your liabilities are in bonds. Your short-term liabilities are $154 million, and your other long-term liabilities are things like the pension obligation. The pension fund is underfunded. you're only funded at about 61%. So that liability is, funded liability is sitting on here, it gets amortized over time.
I'm glad you touched on that. So you say it's underfunded, and it's at about 61%.
Yes.
So if you're able, from a best practices standpoint, how does that compare to a best practice?
Yeah, which had a meeting before this with the pension board. You're in the bottom quartile as far as funding.
And if you're not able to answer, I understand completely, but at least in your opinion, is the status quo sustainable?
Yes, that's a good question, Ernie. We went over that this morning too. The actuary does a run out of the pension.
Mhm.
If you make the 7.5%, that's the assumed investment return that you'll make.
Mhm.
If you make that, and if the county continues to put in the annual required contribution, the fund is completely, even though you're only funded at 61%, there's enough assets there to pay out all the liabilities to all current employees and retirees.
Okay.
And still have money left over.
And then the changes that were made in eligibility a year or so ago are factored into that analysis as well?
Yes,
Okay. Thank you.
While we're on that topic, on page 15, under the pension plan and fiduciary funds, so we had a decrease in that pension fund of $65 million last year. Am I reading that right?
under the budget highlights?
On page 15, fiduciary funds, where it
Oh, I'm
says,
sorry, okay.
the net position of the pension trust fund represented a decrease of $65 million.
Yes.
So is that because the pension board, the investments they made did not
Yeah, but what
produce
happened?
the results that they wanted?
Yeah, with bad investment returns, negative 7% return. The loss was about $68 million.
So how's
Just
that?
consistent with what the market did,
Yes.
obviously.
Market for pensions?
The market, the financial markets in terms of investment returns for 2018 were under, they were negative. You know, overall, it's the whole financial market, so.
It seems somewhat inconsistent with what's published in the media, quite
No,
honestly.
currently, we're in a recovery position. I mean, if you have your investment assets, you know, personal assets, yes, at the end of 2018, especially at the very end, the last quarter of 2018, there were substantial losses in the financial markets.
More
And
profit-taking.
the retirement fund was, did not escape those financial losses. It was impacted as well.
So going back to your statement about it, assuming a 7.5% increase annually, clearly we didn't hit that last year.
No.
So that will cause us to have to add additional funds to the pension plan this year to make up for that lack of 7.5%?
I think the contribution's going up, not understand only, but about $1 million, if I could get right. I think it's going like from $43 to $44 million. So it's not a huge change.
There's several components of what goes into that contribution, I mean, that impact it. And I think that was also a discussion this morning. And in terms of the loss that we experienced this year gets amortized over, what, a five-year
5 year.
period. But yet we had a huge gain in 2017.
I think 18% return.
Yeah, 18% return.
Mhm.
That
Makes
is
sense.
also getting amortized. So you have layers of amortization because of that 5 years. And then obviously there's other criteria that go into making that up. So you have pluses and minuses. And that's a little bit what Bob was referring to of these deferred inflows and deferred outflows, which we have more, I think it was 80,
80
we're talking about 80 million of deferred inflow, and then we have the 70-some million of a deferred outflow. But that's how those are being accounted for. Again, it's all related to amortizing things
Right.
that happen in the current year, but over a longer year period.
With that in mind, go ahead, Tim.
Did they discuss with you, I was at the last pension board meeting where they discussed, they passed a motion to bring to this council a request for an additional amount of funding over 5 years, if I remember correctly. Did that come up in your discussion this morning at all?
We talked, not that specifically. There was some talks about funding and things, but
Okay.
I think, and again, just to your point of what's being discussed right now, is the fact that Bob is referring to our overall funded status. However, the county does keep track, let's say, of the differences in the civilian plan versus the plan for the police. And the plan for the police is a little bit more generous to its retirees than the civilian. And so there's been impact of that from Prop P, especially in
Correct,
terms of
absolutely.
increases in rates. And that plan is actually funded at a lower rate. The civilian is higher, so the blended is the
I understand.
61.
But,
And so they're talking specifically, I think the request was, in terms of perhaps trying to bring the police officer plan up to the level of funding of the civilian plan. And I think that's where the discussion point is.
Two plans, same fund, right?
Yes.
So the impact of Prop P, the attendant raises, the retirees, all impact that fund, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, your model and your analysis absolutely is dependent on a return of at least 7.5%, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Anything jeopardizes that, recession, then the model is no longer functional, correct?
Yeah, but there, even with that 7, there's surpluses in there
I understand.
throughout. But you're right, Ernie, yeah. And but it's a long-term proposition, so you think of the 7.5% as
And I
more like
understand,
a...
I'm not worried, frankly, about current retirees. I'm worried about Sarah Crossley sitting over there, okay? If she were a merit employee, she's a long way from retirement. And it's been one of my pet peeves and concerns for a couple of years now is the liquidity, frankly,
Yeah.
and the appropriate funding of the pension fund. So we'll get into that with the pension board, but I just wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah. Another thing, because we went through all this morning,
Yeah.
but the funding to the pension fund, $44 million, 45% of that is for your active employees. 55% of that, $44 million, is to make up the deficiency from the market losses from 2002, 2008, 2011. So the public might think that the employees get this really rich plan, but a lot of that money is just going to make up that deficiency because of market conditions.
This may be out of your bailiwick, and if it is, just let me know. But looking at the fund as it is, does it make sense for us to consider a change from a defined benefit to a defined contribution type of system?
And we have done that. That was the change that was
the
actually
new
put into
employees,
place
right.
in 2018. So
Mhm.
every new employee now
Has
comes
to
into a
contribute.
contributory
Yes.
plan, yes.
It's not a complete change, but
It's not, yeah, so it's sort of a hybrid, right?
Yeah,
You say?
Right, so you
Yeah.
basically have people who are grandfathered in,
Right.
who were hired prior to that date, or grandfathered into the defined benefit.
Right, so we have a hybrid, basically. It's still
Yes.
defined benefit, but there is a requirement for contributions going forward.
Yes, correct.
And I guess my concern is will that be sufficient over the long haul? And I understand it's hard to project, but
I have the projection here. It is projected to be sufficient if you make the 7.5%. And if the county can afford to make the contribution, I think but the high mark on the contribution over the next 30 years is about 49 million. So it's not going to ratchet up a lot.
okay.
But it is going to go up a little bit.
And that, which rolls us back to revenue,
Right.
right,
Well,
versus expenses.
And I think one of the significant changes that was made in the assumptions this year was to move it from an open plan to a closed amortization layered.
Mhm.
And that in itself is contributing to the fact that it is projected to basically have enough assets. Last year, we were talking in a different
Mhm.
scenario. So that major change in assumption had an impact, a significant impact on whether this plan will be funded to the extent
Okay.
necessary.
Very good, thank you guys very much.
Okay. So back on page 20, we looked at the assets, the liabilities, so the net position, almost got $1 billion in net position. It says the first line item is invested in capital assets, so that's your capital assets minus depreciation and minus any debt on those capital assets, the $825 million. You have some restricted monies, which is those next about 8 lines. They're about $501 million. So those are monies that are set aside for specific purposes. Your unrestricted money is actually a deficit of $327 million. A big part of that, about 172 million of that is your TIF notes and contracts. So there's debt on your books that really the county services are not really responsible for that debt, but having that debt on your books reduced your net position by $172 million. There's about $155 million then deficit in the governmental activities from governmental operations. On page 21, again, this is your statement of activities. This is really your income statement on a government-wide basis, so full basis of the county. It starts with, first it lists all the department expenses, then it's got the airport, and then the component. You've got two component units that by definition of the GASB have to be accounted for in your financial statement. That's because the county controls them or has majority vote on the board. That's the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership, which includes the Port Authority and the Productive Living Board. So those are included in your CAFR. But governmental expenses were $448 million, the $21 million on the airport, and the two component units had about $35 million of expenses. And then from there it subtracts off charges for services. So revenues that come into the county, charges for services, they get subtracted off expenses. And then grants monies that gets collected. Because the county got about $97 million of grants last year. So it's kind of ironic, but the grant money, you might get a capital grant for a road or bridge, and that gets recorded as revenue, but the road or bridge gets capitalized. So that's just how governmental accounting is done. Then it comes over to the net amount, the expenses minus the service charges for services, and the grant monies that come in to come up with the net expenses. And you see, like, the net expenses were $526 million. And then below that, at the bottom, then you got your general revenues. So that's the tax money that comes in to make up that $526 million to pay off the rest of the expenses. So the $588 million was the tax revenues that came in. So then the change in fund balance is the $63 million. You started with the $537 and ended up with the almost $1 billion of net assets.
So at the end of the year, if I'm reading this right, we should be $45 million in the black.
Pardon me, say what?
We should be $45 million in the black at the end of the year. In other words,
Oh, no, that's just the productive
That's
living
the
board.
product, so these last two columns are actually the financial statements of the St. Louis Economic
Okay,
Development
gotcha,
Partnership.
alright.
And so we're looking, you move over to the third column
Okay.
from the.
Yeah, the $1,067 million. That's your net position. But so you had a surplus of $63 million is what it comes down to.
okay, that's what I was looking for.
And this,
Surplus is a better word.
Yeah. And this is on an economic full accrual basis in the county, sort of like, you know, how businesses present their financial statements. But this came out with GASB 35, which is probably about 10 years or 12, maybe 15 years ago. Anyway, then go over to page 22. So your government-wide is full accrual. These are modified accrual available resources. So I was looking, this is sort of like checkbook accounting. This is how you really manage your expenses, because this, you know, sort of mirrors your budget for the county. So this says government funds. So at the top, the assets are $867 million. Well, that's hugely different from the government-wide because your capital assets aren't in there. So when you build a new road or buy a building or buy 50 new police cars, that's an expense, because this is sort of how, like I say, how you keep your checkbook. So you got money coming in, money going out. So long-term assets and long-term liabilities are not included here. Like, so if you have a new bond issue, that ends up being a revenue on your fund statements, and the pay down on the debt will be on here, but it's so the money coming in is revenue, money going out is an expense. The general fund had assets of $234 million and liabilities of about $69 million. So has a fund balance of $134 million. And then it lists all the other major funds, and then, because there's a definition in GASB, what's a major and not a major fund. So the last column, second last column to the right, non-major funds, there's probably about 20 funds in there, which we can look at in a minute what makes that up. But in total, you have about $900 million. Then on the next page, 23, so we got two methods of accounting. This is the reconciliation, or it says your between, just call it your balance sheet. So it starts with the fund balance at the top, the $719 million is your fund balance. And then it subtracts off, or adds back the capital assets minus depreciation, so that's like over $1 billion. And then it's got all these other different timing differences between the two methods of accounting. Like at the bottom, there's $602 million of long-term debt. So that long-term debt is shown on your government-wide statements, but it gets got expensed when, like that was income when the debt money came in, it gets expensed as the debt's serviced over the year. So these are reconciling items between the funds and the government-wide. And so then on the next page, shows you, here's your revenue expenses on a fund basis. All the way to the right, your revenues come in were $804 million. You paid out $780 million in expenses. So you had a surplus of about $25 million. All the funds had a surplus except for the non-major funds had a $21 million deficit. Other financing sources and uses, so your transfers between funds get accounted for, and then there's the proceeds from actually TIF bonds. $25 million of proceeds came in. So that actually takes the $24 million surplus up to a $49 million surplus. So that $24 million was brought in for TIF projects, so it's really not available to the county, but it gets accounted for that way. So your change in fund balance was almost $50 million. You started with $668 and ended up with $719 million in your governmental funds. So that's, like I said, that's more like checkbook accounting.
Right.
And then again, we have the reconciliation that between the fund activities, so the change in fund balance was $50 million surplus, and you had $62 million all the way at the bottom surplus on the government-wide state. But these are the reconciling items like that. The first category there, capital assets. You bought $64 million in capital assets. You took $67 million of depreciation during the year. So that took the fund balance down by $3 million. But there's like in the middle of the page, there's $6.8 million of deferred inflows. So like property taxes that aren't collected within 60 days of your fiscal year end, for accounting purposes, get carried forward. They recognize as revenue in the next fiscal year. You can see like there's the servicing the long-term debt, $7.8 million, and then we've got liabilities that are reported on the government-wide and not on the fund statements, and the change in internal service fund. But all those items reconcile between your two bases of accounting. On page 26.
Bob, before you get into
Sure.
that, you mentioned GASB, G-A-S-B regulations. That's related to the GAP, right?
Right, yes.
So my question is this, we're being told by our Department of Administration that our retirees' health care, when they go out for bid on that,
Yes.
cannot go out for bid with our big group of 4,000 some odd employees.
Okay.
That they have to be separate because of GASB regulations. Do you know anything about that, why that would be?
That's an accounting issue, and Vicki and I had a lot of discussions about that, because your retiree group, even though you offer them health insurance, they absorb 100% of the
Right.
cost. They're sort of
Right.
self-sufficient, even though I think last year there might have been some deficit, but there's an actuary that looks at that, and they set those premium rates. So what you're talking, it's an accounting thing, I don't think there's any legal requirement, because a lot of governments offer extended coverage to either people that take early retirement or even at full retirement.
Okay.
It's,
We are bidding it out so that we can identify what that full cost is. And there is one, a GASB regulation that says if the county is actually contributing to a retiree benefit, that's called a post-retirement benefit, which creates a liability on on the county books. So basically, we've totally separated that, identified what the full cost is for a retiree. The retiree is paying it back, then that avoids a county liability for it. So it's being offered as a benefit to our retirees that they could actually purchase that particular insurance, but it's not a county benefit, meaning it's not funded by the county. So I think that might be.
And I get that part. The part I don't get is why, when they go out for bid, they're doing, why this group has to be bid completely separate, because their rates are much higher because of that small group than the big group everybody else is in. Why can't those go together? I don't understand the accounting purpose for that.
well, just to be sure that that cost is all recovered. The premium cost,
Right.
the claims, the premiums, and the administrative cost is all factored into that, to be sure that.
Into just that group of population. Otherwise, it would be, you would be saying that the county, by putting it together, is actually funding a portion of it, giving them benefit of the younger population, that's, current employees, which actually results in a lower rate. It would be benefiting that group of employees, and therefore, that means the county is taking on part of the liability for funding that, and then having to actuarial determine about how long are we going to be providing that benefit for this group of employees, what is the liability on our books. It becomes much more complicated if you don't do that total separation.
Okay, thank you.
But a good question, yes. So on page 26 and 27 is your proprietary funds, which includes the airport and your internal service fund. So on page 26 is the balance sheet, the statement of net position. So the airport has fund balance of net position of $68 million. And the internal service fund, that's like claim administration, things that shared cost that run through the internal service fund. And on page 27, that's what you asked earlier, Tim, about the airport. It had $700,000 surplus for the year. It did have, I'm trying to think of, it had $1.7 million of capital contributions. Do you remember what that was? Or do you remember?
Well, I do
Those
know
were
that
grants, weren't they?
No, it says capital contributions, so that,
I know what TSA, they are building on to be able to bring in people from out of country. The customs, I know that there's a build out at the airport related to the customs, and I would imagine that that's probably what we're talking about.
So they're funding that? The
No,
TSA?
They've got, they do have a grant to fund.
Yeah, I saw a grant for about that same dollar amount earlier, in an earlier.
Yeah, well, it shows up in that, the government-wide schedule, it's the L, the upside down L. It shows that under the grant contributions, capital contributions as well, or grant contributions. Right here. Capital grants and contributions, because it's basically the same number.
yeah.
That's what I thought, it was about the
Yeah.
same number. Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. So looking, if we hadn't gotten that capital contribution,
Yeah, then,
we would have been upside down.
yes.
It's Spirit.
You brought in 20 million, you paid 21 million, so you really had $1 million loss, yeah.
Yeah, so we actually would have a loss if it
Yeah.
wasn't for that capital contribution.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's, when you look at the airport, you asked about earlier, can you take money out of there, which I don't think there's any legal, because the monies that come in are like, you can't use grant money, but other, fuel sales, charges for services, that money is available if you wanted to take it out of there. The airport has almost $8.3 million in pooled equity, so that money is available for them for capital projects or, whatever you want to use it for.
Of course, I'd be looking at a history of profit or loss from Spirit
Yeah.
Airport to see what kind of patterns are there, so, okay.
Yeah. But, another thing to point out, Tim, is that $1 million loss includes the depreciation, so those you got $2 million.
Right.
That's not really cash
Not
out.
really
It's-
paper
You're
loss, yeah.
you're depreciating half
Sure.
of, capital assets.
And those capital contributions, those are like land and assets, it's not like money.
It's not cash, yeah.
Yeah. Not available cash, yeah. Let's see. The other thing, I did want to go over a little bit, we talked about the pension, go all the way back to page 125, it's 124. On page 124, these are the GASB disclosures under GASB 68 for the county. So these, four years ago or 5 years ago, they came out with these new accounting standards. Eventually, this will have 10 years on here. So at the top, it shows what the pension liabilities are. At the bottom, it shows what your assets are. So you had just over $1 billion in liabilities. The liabilities went up $23 million. And you can see the components of that. Those service costs is what current employees, the cost of current employees for providing their benefits. Interest, that's the 7.5% on your liability. There's some actuarial experience changes. Those are like demographic things, like they make assumptions about death, disability, retirement ages, and so changes in those create experiences. Excuse me, bless you. And there's changes of assumptions at $5 million. That's a change in the discount rate. The assets at the bottom, the assets this year in 2017, you could elect when you do your CAFR, you can elect to use beginning of the year for the pension or end of the year. The county elected to use the beginning of the year. And when we looked at 18, these numbers are different. But this was the year you had $114 million investment gain, which was, I think it was like 18.5% or something
Yes,
like that.
yes.
Benefit payments were $59 million. So you started with 612, you ended with $708 million of assets, but you got a liability of $291 million. And we saw that is on your balance, that liability is on your balance sheet. It'll be amortized over time. So at the bottom there, this says you're funded at 71%. In 2018, that dropped to 61%. And the covered payroll is the payroll on which the contributions are made into the pension plan. But on the top of the next page, 125, the discount rates. So, well, you can't see it here because you don't have 2018, but there's an assumed rate, which in 2014 it was 8%. It got lowered to 7 3/4. I think they're maybe thinking of lowering it again. And then there's a bond rate, a long-term grade A municipal bond rate. So if there's not enough money in the pension plan to pay all future accrued benefits to retirees and active employees, then you have to use a blended rate. And in 2017, that blended rate was 7.61. So what they do, they measure your liabilities up until all your assets are exhausted. And any liabilities above that use that 3.16 discount rate. So that if you're under, but that funding, with like Vicki said, there was a change in the way they amortize the liabilities, which then makes the fund fully funded. So in 2018, the discount rate was just the 7.5%. It wasn't, wasn't a blended rate.
I think in 2018, the long-term rate of return was reduced to 7.5. So
Yeah,
that
right.
was one action that was taken by the board that is not reflected on here as well. And then, obviously, then the closed amortization period as well.
You know what the actual rate of return was in 18?
-7.
Is what?
-7.
-7.
-7?
Yes.
Loss of 7%.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about
Okay.
earlier, yes.
And, I mean, there's a myriad of other stuff in the report. But if you turn to page 113, what's on the horizon for the county, there's some new accounting standards that the county's going to have to implement over the next couple of years. The first paragraph there, they're talking about GASB 84, which is how fiduciary activities are accounted for. That gets changed in the current fiscal year. So Vicki and her staff are working on how to implement these accounting standards. Like the second paragraph there, leases. which is a big one for
Hmm.
governments. Well,
Sure is.
not all governments, but the county has a lot of leases.
Yes,
familiar
it
with
does.
that.
Ways.
Yeah.
We're very familiar with the county's leases.
Yeah, and that's, so, but those leases in the past haven't been on your balance sheet. Now they're gonna be put on your balance sheet, starting in 2020, and you're probably not gonna early implement it, right? Or
As a liability, correct?
They
Well,
show up both as an
both.
asset and a liability.
Help me
I mean,
understand,
and-
why are they assets?
Because you basically have an asset that you have the right to use
Use.
over a period of time.
So you're sort of like capitalizing the asset.
And so the value of that asset is based on the cost of the lease, is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So if the cost of the lease is beyond obnoxiously but fraudulently excessive, then so is the rate of the asset too, right? Corresponding?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But too, the county has internal auditors. I know the internal auditors were doing a special project at the airport. They were looking at all the leases, and Vicky's staff is starting to, look into how this GASB 87, because it's, it's going to be kind of monumental to get that recorded. So there's a GASB 88, which is this year. There's some other disclosures on debt. If you go into your report, there's probably 30 pages disclosures on the debt. There's some additional disclosures that have to be made on the debt. There's the GASB statement 89, how to capitalize interest on capital projects, and that's 2020. And then the other one is majority equity interest, and sort of like, in things that have to be partnerships or things you're involved in that would have to be accounted for differently. And that's this year. And I don't know if there, do you have anything that would come under that?
I don't think we have
Have
anything right
anything,
now
and
that
you
would
don't,
actually fall
no
under
joint
this.
ventures or anything like that?
Yeah. And also GASB 89 is not that difficult, it just basically says you do not capitalize interest. So
Yeah.
So that one is, the most significant
Is the-
GASB changes are 84 and 87, and then obviously we will be having additional disclosures for 88.
Any other questions, or like anything you saw go into a report we can help you try and answer, or?
Go ahead.
I have a more kind of global question. In what ways do you think that our former county executive and his criminal activities impacted this statement?
Yeah. The county made us, during the audit, the county made us aware of things that did transpire, but, a lot of that had to do with the Port Authority and St. Louis Development Corporation. There really, I don't know if there was much, there was like a land exchange that was questionable, and different things we looked at. But I don't think it had much of effect, if any, on the, your basic governmental activities. That's the-
Well, I know Ernie is referring to
Well, the
the
lease.
lease,
Yep.
the value of the lease. Obviously, there's obviously a political impact
Right.
to the
So-
county, very definite. and-
To Lisa's point, if the county executive misrepresented the actual value of the lease, and by that I mean, if we're paying for more square footage than we're using, and if for that square footage, we're paying a rate that is not sustainable based on similar properties in the area, we're paying more than we should, correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of unknown
Right.
future cost in the lease, and that's
Exactly
the
right.
problem.
Right. And there's costs in there that typically small government would not have to pay.
Right.
One that comes to mind is maintenance. We have to pay under that lease for private companies to maintain the premises, where in this building, we have employees do it.
Do it, right.
In every other lease that the county's entered into, the county employees do it. So Lisa's point's well taken. The cost of that one lease alone could very likely cost the county over the term at least $20 million
Yeah.
in unnecessary and excessive costs. So that's why we're so adamant about looking into it. But I don't want to get us off track. Lisa, you have anything else?
No, that was
Yeah.
my main question right now.
The budget director has, for the last 2 years, made a statement in his budget that he submits to the council that, in essence, the county's expenses are exceeding its revenues, and that, to use his words, it's unsustainable, but that, based on his testimony for 2 years, that cannot happen. And by that, he means we either have to cut programs or services, or raise taxes, or both. Would you agree with that? Based on
I
your
would.
analysis here?
There's not a huge surplus, right? I agree with
Correct.
that, yeah. And I don't really know what the 2019 budget says, but right, I mean,
Right.
most governments are like you, their revenues aren't going up, you know.
Correct.
And so you have to control, you know, it's hard. Well, you did a good job of controlling your expenses. And I
Thank you.
think,
We tried hard.
yeah.
We tried hard, although I'm not sure we're going to end up in the black this year. I think we're going to end up in the red, be that as it may. I'm just wanting to see if, based on your analysis, you would agree that, in essence, the county is spending more than it's bringing in, and the only options would be to cut programs or services and/or raise taxes.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that.
That's fair enough.
I think you'd almost have to look at, you know, department by department.
Right. And that's what
see
we've done in the past.
What
That's,
their
you know,
revenue
this-
sources are.
Right. To its credit, this council in the last 2 years probably has done more conscientious budget analysis than any of its predecessors, quite frankly, and to the benefit of the taxpayer. So, and we'll continue to do so. And thank you very much for your presentation today. Anyone have any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, so we appreciate working with the county, and you actually have a really good internal accounting department.
Thank you.
I was kind of amazed at how well she does, because she came from a university, but she's really done a marvelous job of picking this up, and she's got a good staff. And your internal audit staff too, they helped us through, they did several things for us during the audit process, and they were always there when we had a meeting, they always showed up, so it's much appreciated.
Again, thank you guys very much. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Be happy to sit and stay all the time.
Me too. That's what I was like, I feel like